All right, Mr1001nights starts off drawing some false parallels between compelled labor and exchange labor. Now let's break this down to the plumber again. Imagine kidnapping a plumber and forcing him to fix your leaks. And if he doesn't, or if he doesn't do a good enough job, you whip him. Is this the same as calling a plumber and paying the plumber to come in and fix your leak? Or we can look at a factory. In one factory, they are abducting people and forcing them to work for the factory, and in another, they are reliant on people choosing to work for the factory at a given rate. And when Mr1001nights talks about various rights that slaves had, well, that's all well and good, but those rights are not what distinguished slavery from non-slavery. What distinguishes slavery is conscription. And the parallel that he draws between buying one's own business and buying one's freedom from slavery is very false on two levels. One, the slave did not become a slave through exchange, but by prescription of the states involved in the slave trade. And two, when the employee saves up for his own business, he doesn't have to then purchase the right to quit the job from the capitalist. I mean, assuming he didn't enter into a contract requiring him to do so while not under duress. Well, yeah, right. And assuming that he didn't enter into such an arrangement, he just has to buy whatever capital is required to start his business. And we can see that this is really stupid when we recognize that slavery is just like a command economy. The central planner tells people what to do, what to build, prescribes their wages for whatever the works are, and the ditch diggers in the system don't have a choice. And often the state has to resort to oppressive methods in order to get people motivated in such a system where the workers can't be fired and where they don't directly benefit from their own innovations. And so, like the slave owner, the central planner is a compulsory planner of the structure of production, not a market emergent one. And surely in this light, you can see the difference between conscription and long-term bulk rate labor trades that occur as exchanges in a market. And I know this has been said to you many times before, and whenever someone raises these theoretical questions about the concept of wage slavery, you just draw parallels to real slavery. And this is a pattern I see in Mr1001nights' debates about wage slavery. He'll put forth wage slavery as a theoretical proposition, and some free marketer will show why it's wrong through a mapping of the exchange. And then instead of addressing this theoretical critique, Mr1001nights will just draw these false parallels to chattel slavery, which is not even an exchange at all. Then he says something about overarching workers' councils being necessary because of externalities. Like I'm fine with the diffuse capitalist firms or the non-hierarchical firms or whatever you want to call them. And he's saying, well, you're going to have more than that because there are externalities. And no, prior to the state, common law had always developed, and it was never a bunch of workers' councils, which is a meaningless term anyway, because just about everyone works in one capacity or another, or are affected by work in one capacity or another. And there are juries, sure, and if that's what you mean, then okay, but polycentric law works just fine without appealing to anarcho-syndicalist inventions. Even environmental laws, like environmental laws were treated as property violations until big business was able to get to the state first and no longer and bought legislation that didn't require them to pay for the real cost of their pollution. Then Mr1001nights has a definitional dispute with my calling profit the wage of the capitalist, saying that wages come from renting labor and profit comes from property and investment. And technically he's correct. If you look up economics definitions of wage, you'll find something like this that I found from freedictionary.com. There's three different definitions, and the second definition is the economics definition, and it says, the portion of national product wages, economics, the portion of the national product that represents the aggregate paid for all contributing labor and services as distinguished from the portion retained by management or reinvested in capital goods. But the reason I call profit the wage of the capitalist is because I'm explaining that the capitalist is earning or losing depending on how effectively he manages the structure of production. And so a capitalist is an emergent planner coming into existence based on how effectively he satisfies the demands of society. And this is true even in a state society. Let me explain that. Because people believe in the state and support the state, and by properly exploiting this belief, the capitalist will earn more. Right? Capitalists unable to exploit the fantasy structure of the state get weeded out. And a capitalist receiving a grant from the state managed to co-opt the fantasy structure somehow. And also we could say a capitalist getting all his wealth from inheritance while he's satisfying somebody else's demands for having the wealth be kept in the family. So even when a capitalist exploits the state, they are responding to a demand of a society that believes in a state. Okay. But on another level, let's look at the third definition here from freedictionary.com of wage. Definition 3, a fitting return, a recompense. A recompense, right? Often used in the plural with a singular or plural verb. Example, the wages of sin. The wages of sin. And I assume there are also, it is also said that there are the wages of virtue. There are wages of a structure of production in accordance with society's demands, resulting in profit, and so profit can be seen as the wages of correct planning. A loss, the wages of incorrect planning. Now, clearly, I'm using the term wage in a different sense here. And even if you disagree, well, hopefully you can see why I use the term the wage of the capitalist. Then he keeps talking about rent-seeking, saying that in the real world, there is a state to buy off. And this really baffles me. Like, the way to deal with this is clearly to remove the controls on industry, allowing easier entry, the formation of capital, and the breaking of oligopolies and oligopsonies, as I described in my previous video. So even in the short run, my program makes the most sense, because that's how you deal with these problems in the most calibrated fashion. If you want to centrally plan to regulate more of the capitalists, and I guess, impose price controls on things, or like wage and price controls, like that just results in all sorts of discalibration and discoordination. So even in the short run, like, my program makes the most sense. Then Mr1001nights explains how the capitalist wants to pay low wages and the employees want to get high wages, right? And then said because of this dynamic, the organizations like chambers of commerce have an incentive to form a state to impose a system of capitalist privilege. Well, employees and poor people have an incentive to impose a state in order to get free stuff from wealthier people. And this mob always has plenty of ringleaders, and they tend to get at the young and dumb with appeals to the little guy, and so lots of people have incentives to form a state to get what they want. Unions have an incentive to form a state so as to give their demands more teeth, perhaps, trying to get wages higher than equilibrium, than their real market value. I have an incentive to go take everyone's money, for example. I can go around, shoot people, hold them up, and take all their money, because I'd be rich if I could do that. So what? Having an incentive to do something does not mean that you have the capacity to do that said thing. So, mapping out an incentive does not an argument make. Okay. He then makes a little jab about firms being able to enforce whatever they want directly. And it seems Mr1001nights doesn't recognize why the state is vastly more efficient at enforcement. Right? Again, people believe in the state, and through the state they'll support a bunch of BS that they wouldn't support if they knew the policy in question was really the result of a firm's lobbying. Right? Firms get to hide behind the ideological cloak of the state, the kind of ideological support that they themselves do not have. Right? That's one. This is the basic corruption of the state, and how belief in the state causes people to support a whole bunch of stupid things. Okay, then he says that firms will be able to create a state through propaganda. And first off, this is simply not how the first states came about. Okay, the first states were small, highly unified religious cults that then got swallowed up by conquerors who consolidated the initially formed states, yet people chose to remain living in states because the states controlled the most fertile land in circumscribed areas, in river valleys, and in mountain valleys. And of course, the religion actually helped in the consolidation of these states, because of these little city-states, because what would happen is an invading army would come in, they'd win on the battlefield, and they wouldn't have to fight a guerrilla war, because the people of that city-state would be like, well, why didn't the gods protect us? I guess our gods were wrong, and they would put forth this mythology about one god being subsumed under the conqueror's god in the pantheon, and that actually served as a co-opting of the fantasy structure, and that prevented conquering states from having to wage, guerrilla wars, which would typically throughout history have made conquest an unprofitable enterprise, and would have made conquering areas larger than your home base exponentially difficult. Now, imagine people who never lived under a state and didn't know of a state as the normal way of things, and their lives were fine, and you told them that there should be an organization like a firm that controls roads, is the sole creator and interpreter of law, right? Not no common law, right? No emergent law, but we have this institution that is the sole creator and interpreter of law, and this institution also controls the military. Now, in ancient times, these things were justified through religion and through the gods, right? Because that's what people believed in. That is, the state is somehow the order of the gods, which is why all the high priests were connected to, and all of the kings and all the were connected to the gods somehow. That is, either they themselves were demigods, or they're connected to God, or they're also the high priest. And so that's why there's this union of throne and altar early on. Now, that doesn't mean that states wouldn't form the way you say today through business and propaganda, but it means that you have work to do to show how such a thing would occur. Okay? Like, because we don't have people believing in religion, we don't have people believing in divine order. And so when you explain how a new state is going to form de novo, you have to do more than just saying, well, a business will benefit from such an arrangement. So, again, then it talks about regulations. Nobody's against law or regulatory bodies. If someone is selling you something and claiming it's safe and it turns out to be poisonous, then they've engaged in some sort of crime to be dealt with the way crimes are. Right? Today, the state has a monopoly on law, and so people end up thinking that without a state, you wouldn't have regulations. But this goes back to polycentric law. And if you have a problem with polycentric law, then by all means, bring up those objections. But assuming polycentric law is sound, then this is really no problem, because you can just outlaw things like that, assuming they have operational universal support. Now, I'm very health conscious. I always read the labels of what I eat, and when I overeat, I get a little bit chunky. But even then, I'm always eating healthy food. And in the absence of a state, I know I would be looking for some reputable agency that gives decent estimates of what is in the food that I'm buying, through random sampling and stuff like that. And assuming enough others like me demand this service, it will come about. And today, what do you know, roughly 54% of people regularly read the FDA labels on the food that they buy. So I don't think you need a state to have labels. Even if you think it was needed at one point in the past, which I don't even think, but even if you believe that, it's clearly not needed today. Some people aren't going to demand these labels, and they won't look at the labels, and they're willing to put all sorts of garbage in their body. So be it, good for them. For those people, since they're not looking at labels anyway, they might as well get a product that hasn't been tested for calorie and nutrient content, and hence get it at a lower price. And I believe that this will happen. I mean, as long as it's safe and it's not going to cause them to get sick, right? That won't be false advertising. And I believe this will happen, and that lots of people will suffer because, they're like little babies putting things in their mouths without checking, thinking that it's safe just because it was sold at a grocery store out of, that dumb reverence for things that are big and old. Today, firms are required to list ingredients by FDA standards. But the thing is, today, it makes zero sense to list more ingredients than what the FDA requires for two reasons. One, most people don't understand nutrition well enough, and so they see a label and see it's not too absurdly unhealthy, and they'll buy it, right? Thinking that the FDA is protecting them, because this is another one of those ideological things. Oh, it's the state. The state is protecting it. The state is official. Right? When really, like all those RDAs that we see, they all came from like the FDA testing 100, what they called 100 healthy adults in 1968, and looked at what they ate, what their values were, and like interpreted those as being the proper values. Like it's not they don't have any special knowledge of what you need to put in your body. And the second reason is that firms are already required to have an FDA label on their foods, and so in order to have another private rating agency, that may actually be better than the FDA, they would have to put another label beside the FDA label. Now, and so the thing is, like this goes down to marginal cost. Like in a free market, it may be worth, in fact, I'm pretty sure it would be worth it for firms to invest in getting their product approved by a private agency as opposed to no approval at all. However, it does not make sense to expend the resources to pay the money to get your product approved by a private agency when you're already expending resources to get it approved by an inferior product. Because let's say you get 10 points worth of quality inspection from the FDA, and you get 15 points of quality inspection from a private agency. Well, that's really only 5 more points, and you're already paying for the FDA anyway, so it's not worth it then, right? And so the FDA has a crowding out effect, right? And this is similar to what happens with state roads, as explained in my video, Free to Use. Right? But this is all a little bit irrelevant, since if labels for food have operational universal support, it will come about. It will become the common law just as surely as laws against murder do. But you also have problems with state regulation. because the FDA is in a unique position here. Because even if the FDA is known to be corrupt, firms' products must still be approved by the FDA. An example of this is Amphastar, right, a small company that produced a generic blood thinner and had done everything that they needed to do to pass the FDA's regulations. They're all set to go. All right, we've done everything. Just go. They just had like one more step, but then the FDA slowballed them and fast-tracked the development of some competitors' blood thinners. Right after these competitors had wined and dined some FDA officials. Okay. Now, on a total market, Amphastar would have been able to make a horizontal appeal to another regulatory agency, and the FDA would have been disgraced. But as a compulsory monopoly, firms today don't have a choice. Right? They can't make horizontal appeals, and so they don't have, and so the FDA doesn't have real accountability. Right? I mean, they have the phony accountability of vertical appeals to the state courts, but that's not outside of the bureaucracy, and so it's not real competition. Then Mr1001nights just restates that firms have an incentive to kill competition, again, and it doesn't explain. Well, he kind of he asserts how this will be done, but doesn't really explain it at all or make a case for it at all. He then cites Locke and Madison and how the state is required to protect the rich from the ravages of the poor, and that's a fine quote from those people, but they are wrong. It's ahistorical. I refer to the Western territories in the U.S. and the large cattle conglomerates and the owners of mines and railroads in areas that, in fact, didn't have any real state to speak of, right? And yet there were rich people with money, with no state enforcing it. And yet, even in this environment was more peaceful than the incorporated states back east. And the only major attempt of a firm seizing a monopoly was in the Johnson County War, where some large cattle firms who were trying to cartelize hired some mercenaries to go kill a bunch of people in Johnson County, in Wyoming. And because these small-time cattle ranchers in Johnson County were undercutting the cartel, and it was just enough to force the big firms to have to lower their prices. And their attempt to go in there and kill all these people, the justification they used, they claimed that these people were cattle wrestling, which clearly bullshit. But they attempted to go in and kill them all, or kill enough of them to shut them down. And their attempt failed royally, and all these guys were all holed up in a little building somewhere. And the state actually intervened about a week later, and they actually saved the cattle conglomerates' invaders from a well-deserved fate. So that's really the only example of a capitalist attempting to do something like that. And it blew up right in their face, as kind of emergent guerrilla war theories would predict. But aside from that, there were rich people in the stateless West, and with its common laws and its mining town law, and you didn't see people defaulting to communism or not enforcing individualistic private property just because there wasn't a state. Now, on the other side, okay, the Israeli kibbutzes were able to have their communal property in the absence of a state. So don't be so partisan about this, Mr1001nights. Ownership and property is subjective, and both individualistic and communal property can operate side by side. Although really, communal property plots is just another form of private property, but whatever. Then, in talking about states, Mr1001nights fails to differentiate a state forming de novo and a revolution, right? He talks about the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks taking power was not the formation of a state de novo, it was the co-opting of the fantasy structure of another state, right? It was a form of conquest that's not state formation, that's one state knocking out another and taking their position at the top of the hill, of the fantasy hill. And then finally, when talking about the business cycle, Mr1001nights puts forth three arguments. One is the same dumb syndicalist theory of the business cycle. One is the same aggregate demand theory he stated before, and the other is this thing that I've never heard this before. It's the idea, or I don't recall hearing it before, and it's the idea that decisions that are individually rational are not collectively rational, okay, and that somehow leads to overinvestment. Now, here's why that's kind of silly. If an individual predicts that people want cookies, and he invests in a cookie shop, then if his prediction is correct, he earns a profit. If it's false, then he gets a loss. Now, his decision is based on a huge nexus of exchanges and interactions and demands from others. What could rational for an individual but not rational collectively possibly mean? Is it rational for 10 people to make cookie stores in the same mall? Collectively? No. Individually? No. So the rational for the individual and the rational for the collective, in this example that I kind of brought up, is the same. And this statement here like not rational collectively is so vague, because if investing in houses, for example, is not profitable, then it's not profitable, and people will stop doing it to the extent they understand this. And when something is profitable, that being profitable is dependent on collective demand and the collective valuations of prices of everything, right? Whether something is profitable is dependent on inputs and outputs. What is the evaluation of the price of inputs? Well, that's a result of the collective interactions and exchanges that result in prices of the inputs. What about the outputs you produce? Well, that's dependent on the collective interactive evaluations of the value of the thing that you produce. So both the inputs and the outputs of any firm are inextricably connected to the collective valuations of the prices of those things, and whether it's profitable is a reflection of that collective truth. And so what an individual invests in is a collective action, right? And so to say that these investments doesn't make sense collectively, even though it profits you individually, it doesn't make sense collectively, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what prices are. The question is, why do people overinvest in these systematic bursts is the question. Okay, just saying collective action doesn't explain anything, because all prices are collective. Okay, then he puts forward the idea that increasing aggregate demand stimulates growth, which, as I explained before, is bunk theoretically and empirically. But we can quite simply see why it's bunk. Ignore money for now and imagine 10 people producing stuff. In one scenario, they invest 10% of what they produce in new capital that multiplies their labor. And in another scenario, they consume everything that they produce. Which situation will lead to economic growth? The one with the higher investing or the one with the higher consumption? This is not complicated. Investment drives growth. Then Mr1001nights asserts the same cartoonish scenario of the capitalist trying to keep wages down to maintain some nebulous power structure they have, like in this ridiculously roundabout way, right? They're going to depress wages. They're all going to get together and they're going to depress wages, and that's going to maintain their power structure, right? And this, he says, depresses wages and then sets off the business cycle because there's not enough aggregate demand, which he says leads to growth, right? Consumption drives growth, right? This kind of bullshit. This is just more, capitalists have an incentive to do X kind of stuff, right? Yeah, they have an incentive to do it, but so what? And because labor is a market, capitalists are always competing for laborers, just like, you and me, and there's always an exchange. The capitalists want to pay low, the laborers want to earn high, and there's going to be an equilibrium there. So if you have any evidence, please show me the evidence of the grand conspiracy of capitalists forming these flash oligopsonies in a manner that can, cause these business cycles. But until then, this is just a stretch of a theory that doesn't even explain business cycles, as well as the artificial expansion of credit theory from the Austrians. All right, that's all.